Wow, you can really dance. Wow, you can really dance. They said we've both been dancing all this time. What a coincidence.
Welcome, friends, new and old. We're back this week talking about Doctor Who, the 60th. Scratch that. The Christmas special 4 according to Disney+, the first episode that fully features Ncuti Gatwa. This one's entitled The Church on Ruby Road. Now, before we get too far into this, there will be lots of spoilers ahead. If those aren't for you, consider this your last warning. Let's crack on with the show. I felt like it was more of a mixed bag because at the end of the day, I found a solid core of maybe about 15 minutes of pretty strong emotional impact in this overall story, but the rest of it was kind of just... It's a grab bag of Doctor Who, at least new Doctor Who stuff, kind of just thrown in a blender and mixed up. Almost everything in this episode, outside of maybe the goblin stuff, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, seemed like it was intentionally calling back, referencing, homaging, and just paying tribute to all of the new Who stuff we've seen before. And it's not necessarily just RTD era stuff, and I think that was probably an intentional decision. Right down to the fact that this episode was kind of playing off the whole Rose thing, the introduction of Eccleston's Doctor back in the day, just with a little bit less mystery played around who and what the Doctor is, but it was also kind of playing on that reintroduction when Matt Smith came in with the whole cracks in time, the cracks in the houses, even the leather jacket and a few of the mannerisms, and a little bit of the way the Doctor acted even felt very Eccleston-like in this episode, mixed with a touch of Matt Smith, and just even a lot of the other things in this episode were just doing things we've seen before. So it was kind of like, I don't know, hitting the best of while trying to introduce this fresh start, because I do believe this is intended to be a jumping on point for a heck of a lot of people who aren't really familiar with the show. So to kind of bring in things that were touchstones for some of the older audience may have been an intentional way to kind of fast track us through that. Now, the parts that didn't feel specifically like callbacks to older Doctor Who were the whole goblin thing, and I think a lot of that was very reminiscent of maybe 80s movies along the lines of a Labyrinth crossed with Time Bandits, something like that, especially using the Goblin King. And I am kind of intrigued by the way they're kind of bringing forth these more fantastical or mythical elements into the show, and I think all of that ties back to Wild Blue Yonder, that whole invoking of myth at the very edges of the universe. I think that is going to be very, very heavily played up in the ongoing situations in the show, not only with the storylines and bringing in characters that are a little bit less science fiction-y. Not that Doctor Who of the past has really struggled that much to define everything in hard sci-fi. Goblins exist, and I think part of that is the rewriting of reality, or at least the updating to a new version of reality that was created when the Doctor, David Tennant's Doctor, invoked those myths at the edge of the universe. I think by doing so, he has updated the very universe to include all of these fantastical elements, and that's going to hopefully put a brand new spin on this show, add a little bit of a new touch to an old formula. Not that it's really going to recreate the formula, but it's going to add a new twist. Because these things are outside the realms of just figuring out through scientific means, perhaps that's going to leave the Doctor to come up with more inventive solutions, or to at least not have all of the answers to know all of these things, because these are creatures and beings that don't really conform to the standards of normal logical rules of reality. And speaking of coming up with new plans, new inventions, all of that stuff, the gloves. I know that the gloves in this episode that used Mavity, so they're calling that back, which is kind of an intriguing point to see how frequently that's brought up and referenced. And are we now kind of getting outside of the fixed points in time? Can we actually change things that are very pivotal to history? Because if that's the case, this whole invoking of myth at the edge of the reality, which I keep harping on because I think it's going to be a very large and looming presence in this series, is this now kind of overwriting these fixed points in time? Or is that kind of a result of the Time Lords no longer kind of policing things? Although the Reapers from Father's Day, which was fairly heavily referenced in this episode, again, as I said, a lot of callbacks to things like that, are those still existent? And if so, that would be intriguing because we haven't seen those in a long time. But anyways, I'm digressing from the point. The gloves. So those were a nice kind of, again, a very wacky and out there sort of idea. A lot of people were kind of hesitant to think that they were a good inclusion. I don't think they were probably the best, most exciting thing I've ever seen in my life, but I like what they represent, because this version of the Doctor, Ncuti is supposed to be the post-14th Doctor, the post-David Tennant version, who is kind of healed from all of the running and the trauma and all the Time War stuff, all of those heartbreaks, all of those things that have happened in the past. He's supposed to be much more on stable footing right now because of the work David Tennant is currently putting in off-screen somewhere. So to have him now kind of coming up with these solutions, he has stopped running, he is staying in one place for longer and kind of planning for the future. And I very much hope that we see some of this kind of further on in the future. It kind of implies the fact that he is now actually actively putting effort into what's coming in his future. So he sits down and plans for eventualities. Instead of just stumbling from problem to problem, from person to person, he's sitting down thinking and analyzing and saying, you know what? These are situations that I seem to get myself in quite frequently. The next time I encounter such a situation, what would I like to have to make this much easier on me? So he came up with these gloves. I hope we get to see more similar things in the future. Not necessarily to the extent of someone like Batman, but that sort of thing, to show that he has actively been working on these problems. I think we should also take a moment to address that musical scene. I was completely unspoiled for this. I did not know it was coming up. I hadn't heard the song prior, like apparently a lot of people, especially in the UK, had. So when it came up, I was kind of a little bit flabbergasted. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it. It was actually integrated into the story in a way that generally made sense, at least insofar that it was part of the story and not just out of the blue singing. The fact that the Doctor actually joined in this sing-song conversation as a bit of a distraction and as a bit of a way to kind of learn a bit more what's going on. The only part that was a little bit iffy to me was the fact that Ruby also joined in on this. And I suppose a lot of that might come down to the fact that she's still a bit of a mystery right now. There's obviously a lot going on behind the scenes that we are not privy to yet, and that's going to be an entire exploration for the upcoming series. But the fact that she joined in apropos of almost nothing, that felt a little out of the blue, like she should have been a bit more out of her element and not able to just cobble together these rhyming lyrics. But, because we know so little about her, I don't want to put that on her that she's just a typical normal human, because we know that's not the case, and we don't really know where the storyline's going, so I will kind of reserve my judgment on that for later. Another point in a little bit of favor for this episode, this being a Christmas special, I'm not going to sit here and kind of claim the Christmas specials have always been the best episodes of Doctor Who. They're generally a bit more lighthearted, a bit more fun, a little bit more, I'm going to say family friendly, but that's not the case because there are some dark and, gritty things that happen in them from time to time, but they're generally less focused on the ongoing storyline and just more of a self-contained, fun, fluffy story that doesn't necessarily have to conform to the rest of Doctor Who because they are specifically slated to be a Christmas special. This one was kind of pulling a bit of double duty by introducing the entirety of the whole new series, so as that sort of thing, it was a little bit wonky, but I don't want to sit here and act like the Christmas specials are generally the be-all, end-all of the greatest Doctor Who episodes. The whole storyline going on about finding out who Ruby is, her backstory, her foundling status, coming back to that a bit later, was nice. It was good information, but that part was just kind of not emotionally fulfilling. It really didn't hit until we got to spend the time with her family, and then to see her removed from the equation. That was a very effective part of this episode, especially considering we had not met any of her family prior to this episode, let alone her. So to see them so significantly altered by her presence, both in being there and then what their lives would be like had she been removed from the equation and never joined their family, that was a very emotionally impactful element. And I think a heck of a lot of this is supposed to be mirroring and potentially even foreshadowing what's going on with the Doctor. Because this whole episode was basically built around the fact that coincidences are a thing that was attracting the goblins, but I think there's more than that. If you take the Doctor's backstory, especially that newly constructed timeless child backstory that a lot of people are unhappy with, myself included, and you take his foundling, his adopted status, his unknown history, his unknown past, that's exactly what we're seeing with Ruby here. And in this episode, we get that whole there but for the grace of God go I situation where once she's removed from the equation, everyone that her life has impacted is significantly worse. And I think we're going to see a similar function with the Doctor later on if he were removed from the equation. If you think back to Turn Left, another kind of callback, in the world without the Doctor, everything just got progressively worse and worse and worse. And I think that's inevitably what the Timeless Child is going to come to be. I don't even think that's necessarily what Chibnall had in mind. I'm not entirely certain he had anything in mind. It was just a new toy to play with. So to see Russell T Davies take the ball and run with it, I'm hoping he's going somewhere. But I genuinely feel like this is all setting up the fact that the universe needs the Doctor. In whatever shape or form the Doctor is taking in this moment, the universe is better off for having one. And I think it's going to possibly be some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy or maybe a predestination paradox where there is a universe without the Doctor where everything is horrible and terrible and the Doctor has to go back in time to basically create themselves or to start over or to be reborn from that initial regeneration. And that's going to be this time loop, I guess you could say, where the Doctor isn't coming from this unknown place. The Doctor is coming from the Doctor into a universe without the Doctor, maybe something along those lines. I haven't really thought about it, but I think this is kind of setting up those seeds that we are now dealing with people that are intrinsically linked to the betterment of a world, the betterment of people, the betterment of a universe, and because we're learning this through Ruby, it's going to be a mirror of the Doctor. Speaking of which, Ruby's parentage, her ancestry, is unknown. There's no DNA on file for her parents, and she was left as a foundling in apparently 2004, so that's actually kind of an interesting callback. She was left as a newborn basically around the time the New Who revival was first getting off the ground and coming to our screens. So she was a child when the revival of Doctor Who, the New Who as a lot of people like to call it, was just starting. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it definitely seems a little bit intriguing that she is basically the age of the show. We don't know her parentage. We see that flashback scene, or I suppose it's more than a flashback because the Doctor travels back to see whoever it was dropping her off at the church, chooses not to do anything about it, and I think that's a very intentional choice. A lot of people were baffled by it. I'm not entirely certain why that happened. I think it was maybe because he learned in this episode, and he learned through all of his dealings with trauma and his betterment and all of that stuff, that he can't be the one to solve problems for everybody, at least their own personal problems. This is something she's going to need to come to terms with and deal with on her own. So for him to kind of go out of the blue to fix this problem for her right off the bat isn't his purview, and he owes her more than that. I'm probably projecting too much onto it. That's where I think it's going to be. We also have this whole mystery of who is Mrs. Flood, and that's where I think this episode had strengths. The emotional 15 minutes, like I said, worked well. The rest of it was kind of iffy to me. But the implications, the possibilities of all of these mysteries are really what had me on the edge of my seat and kind of desperately wanting to know where we go next. And I think those things are things that we've seen in Doctor Who before Russell T Davies is good at, so I definitely feel like we may be getting some satisfactory answers on those, hopefully before too long. Hopefully we get some nice hints, because a lot of people are speculating who Mrs. Flood is. I think there were a couple of intriguing things dropped in this episode that are supposed to give us hints to her identity. A lot of people are thinking that it's River or Susan or all of these other people, Jenny, I don't even know, Romano, all of these things. But I think her name, coupled with the fact that she said
police box. I haven't seen one on the streets of London for 50 years.
So I think, A, that could potentially be a clue as to who she is. She could be a character who was last seen 50 years ago on the streets of London with a TARDIS. I'm not well versed on that era of Doctor Who, so I'm not entirely sure who we last saw 50 years ago in London by a TARDIS, who we haven't seen since that she could be. Also, the name Flood, this is just my own personal thought process because I keep going back to that new invocation of grand, mysterious beings on the edge of reality. I'm wondering if she may be a part of that, similar to how the Toymaker was allowed re-entry into our universe because of this, and we know there are other beings who are allowed re-entry. I think the goblins were created if not existent before they were allowed to come into existence from myth, fairy tales, storybooks, all of that stuff. Because of this, flood could be some sort of way of saying that there is a flood of all of these new beings, these reintroduced beings, all of these things that are now able to re-access or access our universe for the first time. So she is kind of the point person of a flood or an influx of new beings. That's just my wild thought. I have no idea if that's actually something that makes sense or not, but I'm just putting it out there because out of all of the returning characters and all of the theories, that's one I really haven't seen, so why not put my own spin on it? Something that really stood out to me, and not really in a great way, is when he took down the pirate ship or the goblin ship at the end. He impaled the Goblin King. And I know it wasn't intentional, it was kind of a byproduct, but it just seemed a little off-putting to have a death result this way. And again, that kind of felt very similar to Capaldi's first appearance, or was it the second appearance? Maybe it was his first appearance, when that little clockwork guy fell out of the blimp and was impaled on the spike, or the church steeple, or whatever it was, and we were left to question, is he a good man? Is he responsible for this or not? So it seems like they're kind of purposefully invoking all of these debut Doctor episodes, although I don't know if I necessarily felt any from the debut of Jodie. Again, I may be mistaken on that. There were definitely a lot of things brought up in this. Oh, even the scene where the mother was crying when Ruby was deleted from the timeline. She didn't know who she was. She didn't know why she was crying. The doctor was like, why are we crying right now? That's almost identical to what happened when Rory was deleted from the timeline and Amy was crying over him but didn't know why. So it's just very intriguing to have all of these things thrown back in the show very, very purposefully. I mentioned earlier that I did like the gloves for what they potentially represent. I don't necessarily care for the Sonic design whatsoever, and it seems like most people don't. I'm very hopeful there is some sort of reason as to why this change has happened and why they're going with this different version of the screwdriver other than just product placement and trying to come up with a new design. I'm not really sure what that could be, so if you have any ideas, leave all that down below. So yeah, I just talked a hell of a lot more than I ever intended to. I didn't even get to all the things I probably wanted to bring up, but I feel like I touched on a lot of the things I was hoping to. So what did you think? Did you like this episode? Are you even watching Doctor Who? Where do you think we're going from here? I purposely stayed away from the trailer for the new series because I kind of wanted to talk about this without having that added knowledge, although I have seen a couple things online with speculation that Martha Jones is definitely coming back in it, so I guess we'll see about all that. Leave all your thoughts down below, like, share, subscribe, do all those fancy YouTube things, but until next time,